Good morning.
Good morning, brother.
Guess you can hear me, can't you? Good to see everybody this morning. I want to start with a little bit of a story from my past that maybe some of you have experienced. A few years before we moved to Lubbock, I ended up having a bad eye infection. And I wore contacts and I hated glasses. And so I was stubborn enough to just keep wearing the contacts, even though I had an eye infection. Well, it went from bad to worse, and I was busy working. I didn't really have time to do anything about it, and it got so bad that in order to even see in the sun, my eyes had gotten so sensitive, I had to have on sunglasses with a cap down to here and a hooded sweatshirt all pulled over just because I'd gotten so sensitive to light. Well, when I finally went to the eye doctor and actually stopped wearing the contacts, it was a different eye doctor than the one I normally have. He looks at my records and he says, "Have you ever thought about getting LASIK surgery before?" And I said, "Well, I've thought about it, but that's as far as it's gone. I'm not really one that likes having my eyes messed with, so I was scared of the surgery and all of that." And he said, "Well, you would be a really good candidate." And we set it up, and there was a month lead time. I had to not wear contacts for a month. I had to get over the infection. Well, in the meantime, there was all of this time to prepare for the LASIK surgery. So I had literature that I was reading. I watched some videos, and I remember thinking, usually when something hurts, you close your eyes. It's like you can't close your eyes when they're working on your eyes. And I started thinking all these various things, and I was really dreading this experience. I was dreading the whole process of going through. I knew that I wanted to see better and all of that and not need the contacts. So I was willing to go through it, but I was dreading it. And of course, I did. After it was over, I got through it. It did hurt a little bit, obviously, and all of that goes along with it. But when I was done and set up off that table, my vision had been perfected. And I could see like I'd never been able to see before. I've got these goggles on. We're driving home, and I'm telling Sarah, it's like, I could see to drive home. I can see that good, that quickly. I was so excited about it. But anyway, it worked obviously, and I have 20/20 vision today and all of that. But there are a lot of people that I talked to because after it was over, I was willing to tell everybody, "Hey man, you ought to get LASIK surgery if you've got glasses." And I could not believe the people that just wouldn't even go there because they were afraid of it. They were afraid it might blind them. They were afraid of whatever may happen if they went ahead and got LASIK surgery. So rather than actually do it, they just didn't look at it. They held back. They just didn't go there. Well, there's some similarities. Now, that's obviously a much lower scale than where we're going this morning with our First Peter series in First Peter chapter 4. But there's some similarities to what Peter is addressing and what I just talked about in that story. And especially when we get to the end, we're going to come back to that. So we're continuing our series, First Peter chapter 4. We're going to be looking this morning at verse 12 through 19. Now, up to this point in this letter, the realities of suffering as a Christian have been made evident. We've heard that in some of the previous lessons that we've had. So this text, by the time we get over to chapter 4, this text begins with, "Brethren, do not be surprised." So it's abundantly evident that suffering as a Christian is a real thing, and it's obvious that something is coming. There's something coming. It isn't good. When we look at history, we know for what was probably coming after First Peter writes this letter was incredibly horrible to endure. Some of them didn't make it through, some of them did, but the Christian faith lived on. And of course, that was the big thing. Well, what this text does, there's a number of things we could look at in here. But what I want to hone in on this morning is the advice that we can see in this text as to how to properly deal with Christian suffering or Christian persecution. So the purpose of our lesson this morning, You're going to have to flip them, Harold. It's not working. The purpose of our lesson this morning is to gain the proper perspective of Christian suffering so that we will better know how to handle it when we're faced with it. And we're going to look at three major areas of this text that helps us accomplish that we can see. The first one comes right out of verse 12, because he says, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you, which comes upon you for your testing." So the first one that helps us get this in perspective is to understand what it really is. And it's identified as the fiery ordeal, or the refiner's fire. If you look back at chapter 1 and verse 7, this concept was introduced at that time. So that the proof of your faith being more precious than gold, which is perishable even though tested by fire. So we're dealing here with what is known as the refiner's fire when we look at this fiery ordeal. And this is the fire that purified precious metals. It comes from the Greek word, I don't know how to pronounce it, but it would be P upsilon rho omicron omega. So I suppose that would be purao or something like that. But in English, the transliterated is P-U-R-O-O. What does that begin to sound like? It begins to sound like the word pure. And as a matter of fact, that's exactly where the word pure comes from. Our English word pure comes from the Latin word, which is spelled P-U-R-U-S. And that word finds its origin in the Greek word that we see here in 1 Peter 4. So the word pure, as we use it today, is rooted right here in this concept of the refiner's fire. Precious metals are found all throughout the earth in their raw form, and they're just rocks. They're all intertwined into rocks in the earth. And the process of refining these metals is somewhat complex. First of all, the rock has to be mined. Here's an example of a modern day open pit mine where gold may come from or many other things. And it's always been that way. It has to be mined out of the earth. It has to be extracted from the earth. And when they get it loaded up, it's in bigger pieces in the trucks. Here's an example of gold ore, a larger piece of gold ore. And as you can see, it's mostly rock, but it's obvious that there's gold scattered throughout that. Well, it's then broken up into manageable pieces. And by manageable pieces, it's usually pieces no bigger than like 2 inches across. And this way they can continue through the refining process. Well, after this, it is washed. This is an example of a modern day wash drum where they wash whatever it may be. This could be gold, it could be even iron. It's all kind of the same process. Well, after the washing, it is heated up until it is melted into a liquid state. Now, sometimes things like borax are added in order to aid in the separation of the dross or the impurities from the metal. It's a sensitive process. It requires precision in time, precision in temperature, and so on and so forth in order for this process to work out correctly. The impurities are usually lighter than the metal itself, and they tend to float to the top. And those impurities are removed. And of course, the process of doing all of this, the person doing it, it's a bit of an art form, has to know when this is correct. When has all the impurities been removed? But the metal is not removed from the fire until it is pure. And here behind me is a picture of pure gold. Here's what it looks like after it's gone through all of this process. This is a word picture illustration that is meant by the fiery ordeal. This is what Peter is getting at when he uses this word. Think about this just for a moment. God has taken us from the world in our raw form. The process for us begins when we're washed. The trials that we face in this life as a Christian serve to refine and purify our faith. That's what Peter's getting at in this as he says this. He's putting it in perspective so that they know what this fiery ordeal is. It is meant to purify their faith. That is the point of using this word illustration in the letter. Some things are coming at you that are not going to be fun, but they're going to serve a purpose to test and strengthen and purify your faith. So I am writing you so that you are ready. So the first thing that we need to understand in order to gain a proper perspective on Christian suffering is to know what it really is. It's a purifying process for our faith. The next thing that we need to understand, and we see that in this text, is what to expect. We need to know what to expect. Look at verse 13. In verse 13, but to the degree that you share in the sufferings of Christ, keep on rejoicing. So one of the things we need to expect is to share in the sufferings of Christ. Well, what does it mean to share in Jesus' suffering? That's something I've always kind of wondered. Obviously, we can't go back and physically join him in an unspeakable scourging and be nailed to a cross with him. Those are the sufferings that he went through. And we can't go back and do that with him. And furthermore, why in the world is sharing in any sort of suffering a reason for rejoicing? When our suffering is a result of patterning our behavior after His divine example, that is how we are, in a sense, sharing in His suffering. And by doing so, we have a reason for rejoicing. Think about it this way. Look at the sharing in the suffering of Jesus like this. Because I am acting like Christ, I am being treated like Christ. I think that gets us honed in on what the idea is, because that is certainly something to rejoice about. Now, it's tough for us to see it in that perspective in our human eyes, but when we understand that, when we have this in perspective, verses like 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 5, for just as the sufferings of Christ are ours in abundance, so also our comfort is in abundance through Christ. That verse is put into perspective when we see what the suffering of Christ, sharing in the suffering of Christ really is. Well, part of this expectation of suffering is also to expect to be reviled for His name. Look at verse 14 back in 1 Peter chapter 4. In verse 14, if you are reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed. So part of this suffering for the sake of Christ is to be reviled for His name. This expectation challenges me personally. And I can assume I'm probably not the only one. And I wonder if you might feel the same when you really think about it. But I ask the question of myself when I read this. What am I doing in my life that might actually result in me actually even being reviled for His name? Am I doing anything? And what does this tell me about my faith when I look at that? Ask yourselves these questions as you look at this. I'll obviously leave that up to you to ponder the answer in your own life, but I hope that challenges you. What are we actually doing that would even result in us being reviled for the name of Christ? And the expectation is stated another way also in verse 16, the idea of suffering as a Christian. This is one of those unique places where we see the word Christian used in the New Testament. You can go ahead and put that one up there, Harold. The expectations are clear. Suffering for Christ, with Christ, as a Christian. So that leaves one final thing that we need to look at. How do we respond to this? There's several things scattered throughout this text that we see, and we'll look at them as the don'ts and the do's. First of all, don't be surprised. That's how he begins the letter. Trials for a faithful Christian are a reality. Excuse me. That's how he begins this text, not the letter, verse 12. Don't be surprised because these things are just a reality for those who follow Christ. Another one that we see here, don't be ashamed. The Bible never equates Christian persecution or suffering with shame. The first century Christians were proud to die for the cause of Christ. We should view it with the same amount of courage. Read Fox's Book of Martyrs sometime and just look at what some of them said as the fire was being lit under them while they were hanging on the stake. They were proud of it. They were proud to die for it. We should be too. Don't suffer for the sake of sin. We see this in verse 15. And he mentions several things. Don't suffer as a murderer, an evildoer, a troublesome meddler, and all of that. I see this as a clarifying statement. I think he's saying don't go commit a sin so that you can suffer. Suffer for your uncompromising righteousness in Christ. That's what the suffering is to be for. And also don't crumble under pressure. That's always the case when we see persecution addressed. It's going to be tough. And historically, we see just how tough it was. And this is why it's equated to the refiner's fire. If they can go through that, their faith is pure. Precious metals aren't purified in 70-degree offices. They're purified in hot fires. And so the things we go through, we need to expect them to be hot. Now let's look at some do's. He says in verse 13, keep on rejoicing. We have everything to rejoice for in our salvation in Jesus Christ, and that clearly includes the suffering we may endure. Know that you are blessed because the Spirit of God rests upon you. He's given us our pledge. We have that inheritance. It is a guarantee. And it is that carried them through. It's that should carry us through. The guarantee that God has put His stamp on us and said, you are mine. And in verse 19, there's three things that we see. Suffer according to the will of God. Another clarifying statement. There's no reason to do something irrational to cause suffering. The idea is to suffer for Christ and what we're doing for Christ. And of course, entrust your soul to God. If we're ever going to get through anything, we're going to have to put it in God's hands. And that's what he tells them to do. And that's what Peter and John had to do back in Acts. Perhaps you'll remember chapter 4 of Acts, and they're being told that they can no longer speak the name of Jesus. Well, how do they respond? In Acts chapter 4, 19 and 20, level 1, you probably should have had this as memory work. I'm assuming Ray used to assign it. But Peter and John answered and said to them, whether it's right in the sight of God to give heed to you rather than God, you be the judge. But we cannot stop speaking about the things that we have seen and heard. We can't stop. We have to do this. Well, later on, they prayed about it. They prayed for boldness. And that's what they did. They prayed for boldness. They gave it over to God. And what they do, they kept preaching. And what happened? They kept getting bothered about it. But did it stop them? No, it didn't. They continued to do the will of God. And over in 5 and verse 29 of the book of Acts, look what they said in this case. But Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than men. Same thing's going on. They're being told to quit. They're not going to do it. They're going to do the will of God. We must also do the same thing. Don't be surprised. Stuff that you don't like is coming your way in some form or another. It was hardcore persecution in the days that this letter was written. We may face worse in the future than we're facing right now. Thank God our lives are not currently at risk like theirs was. But having said that, if we're standing up to the faith like we ought to be, it's going to have some pushback from the world. And you should expect that. This letter has a built-in so what in all of the do's and don'ts. Don't be surprised. Don't be ashamed. Don't suffer for the wrong things. Instead, suffer for the will of God, keep doing His will, and rejoice in the real payoff that we know awaits us. Realize that this world and its troubles are God's way of refining your faith. As we leave here today, I want you to examine your life and ask yourself this question. Am I holding back so that I don't have to suffer? This is the thing that comes around on us as we read a letter like this. We see what they went through. We don't want to do it. If we hold back just a little bit, we probably don't have to do it. So that's the real challenge here. Are we holding back so we don't have to go through it? And that's what I want you to leave here thinking about this morning. Because if you are holding back in any way, you're resisting God in His effort to purify your faith. Here's the challenge. Find one area of your life where you know you're holding back. It's a time of self-examination. Then focus on changing that thing. Hone in on that one. Pray about that one. Pray for boldness, knowing that God is with you, and let Him strengthen your faith. Let's all challenge ourselves to walk out of here proudly and walk into the fire so that God can accomplish His work in